Check it out, y'all. It's the new Trek CheckOUT, culmination of a 3-year project between Trek and SRAM's RockShox brand. Yes, you're looking at a full suspension gravel bike. 55 mil in the rear, a all new 60 mil Rudy XL fork up front, clearance for 2.25s front and rear, some crazy wide stance flared out bars, and a ride unlike anything I've had before. We're gonna dig into my thoughts on what this bike is like to ride in beautiful places like the Rockies of Colorado, where it's a good fit, where it's a weird fit. To introduce this bike, Trek invited me and a few other journalists down to the Colorado Springs headquarters of SRAM, which is where a lot of the RockShox R&D is located. They showed us all sorts of cool tests, and unfortunately they wouldn't let me take my camera along for any of them. Got to ride with some of the Trek folks, some of the SRAM folks on the local Colorado Springs trails, which was humbling for me. I am, however, able to share some of the conversations I had with the Trek engineers and product managers about what is this? What was the thinking behind this? And what was the path to getting to here from where they were 3 years ago? And I'll also give you my philosophy on this after a couple weeks of riding it. Is the idea to push your rides further into crazier, gnarlier terrain, or just to be comfier doing the rides that you normally do? I hedge a little bit towards the latter. Now get comfy and let's check out the CheckOUT. So as I mentioned, that initial first ride was on straight up mountain bike trails with mountain bike riders who were much more competent than I. And I felt over my head. You know, these guys had the dropper post down the whole time, weaving back and forth. And after that one ride, I was falling a little bit back more into the, if you're gonna go mountain biking, why not just ride a mountain bike? However, after riding it more on gravel roads, chunky roads, 4-wheel roads like this that I often ride on a rigid gravel bike, I was like, you know what, just doing these normal rides on a bike like this, yes, you're paying a weight penalty for sure, but it was a lot more comfortable. Certainly going downhill, but even, you know, coming uphill with the extra girth of the tire and the suspension that you can lock out both front and rear. You have to do that manually. You can't do that remotely on this setup. This weekend, for instance, we came up here on Caribou Road, you know, way up outside of Nederland, home of the likes of American national champ legends like Alex Housen, Ruth Winder Edwards. This is the type of ride that I do on a rigid gravel bike, and it's just slower and a little more awkward. Doing this ride this weekend, I was happy to have this bike for well over half the time. Climbing, there's no getting around the weight. This is like 26 pounds or so, as you see here, not counting the bottles or the saddlebag, but with pedals and cages and such, in a medium large, 26 pounds. Not a light thing. Definitely felt that going uphill, but riding not technical stuff, but just rough stuff, right? Like going down washboard descents, I felt much more comfortable at speed than I do on rigid bikes. Thanks to destroying my arm last year, getting 26 screws and a metal plate and cadaver bone and all this in here, my arm kind of sucks now, and it gets overpowered pretty quickly, and I get like arm pump basically, but all the way to my shoulder, and that starts to hurt and feel unstable after just a few minutes of rattly descending. So having that is a weird barometer of sorts. Riding this, I felt much more comfortable, both physically and mentally, descending on chattery washboard and bumpy Jeep road. Which brings us back to the age-old question of what a good bike is and a good bike setup is depends on where you live and how you like to ride. On the ride with my buddies this weekend, most were on traditional rigid gravel bikes. A couple were on mountain bikes. The mountain bikes fell off the back a little bit on some of the longer climbs, and then were able to coast down more comfortably and sometimes more quickly than the rigid bikes. This should come as no surprise, right? If you've got a road bike on one side, a mountain bike on the other side, you know what the strengths of each are. And yes, of course, the strength of the rider is the main thing. You know, I was riding with a couple old pros like Colby Pierce and Don Powell, and they on skinnier, like, I don't know, 38 tires, rigid bikes, were clearing technical things that I was unclipping and walking over. So yes, of course, it's up to the rider about how you can handle the bike. I also took this on some straight up mountain bike trails where I felt out of my element, wishing that I had just a straight up mountain bike for the task, but was happy to have this on a more adventurous gravel ride like the one up here. I'll put a link to my Strava ride down below in case you live in Colorado or you're visiting Colorado and you want to check this out, especially this time of year. Aspens are going off. Say okay. Maybe we bring the wool socks because you're going to get your feet wet.
I did the wrong line.
Oh! Oh! It got deep and greasy, and now my butt's wet. So those are some of my initial thoughts. Now let's go hear from some of the folks at Trek and RockShox about the engineering and the thinking that went into the bike construction and the suspension.
The development of this bike initially started at the end of 2021, transitioning into 2022. So we've been working on the bike for a long time. The development started with just kind of an off-the-wall proto idea of what a rigid bike would be for a really progressive geometry, kind of maxing out what the industry was thinking about doing, head angle and tire clearance and things like that. And then yeah, it took a long time to kind of gestate into what we rode today.
What were some of the early objectives? Did you start with geometry? Did you start with a travel figure? Did you just start with a feel, like I want to ride this type of trail? Or like what were your personal goals and what were Trek's goals with?
Yeah, it was kind of twofold. A few of us within the building kind of enjoy underbiking. Wisconsin has a big cyclocross scene and heritage, and so we were curious about that market as it was developing. And so initially it was just kind of trying to prove out like whether these monster cross bikes were actually something that Trek would ever explore or find useful in the market. And then as we made prototypes of that and rode them, it was just like maximizing fun. We could do big dumb rides from our house that was connecting a lot of gravel or road with single track trails that we ride all the time and know really well and are kind of bored with on our XC race bikes or something similar. So yeah, that was kind of the impetus, and then we just kept cranking up the fun meter by adding more capability with front suspension and rear suspension.
How many iterations did you go through in terms of physical iterations? I know it's kind of hard to keep track, like how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? And like, what does CFD count? Does FEA count? But just looking at these physical samples behind you, like at what process, at what stage did this come along, and how many physical iterations did you make?
So this is probably, if you want to call it Mark III. So there's two. There was a fully rigid prototype before this one, and then a suspended prototype before this one. This one really allowed us to have a lot more capability to change different things. We have multiple rear triangles for this bike that we tried chainstay lengths on. We tried different suspension kinematics by having multiple swing links that bolt in and different mount points. And then we could play a little bit by being able to swap the rear triangle with BB heights and different geometries for the rear. We had already iterated by this point on wheelbase and some of the trail and front end figures that we wanted. So then this was just trying to figure out how we would actually execute that rear suspension part. As you said, it's a lot of iterations, and at this point we're still in this very macro scale phase. And then as we kind of get through into the carbon fiber proto and then the final product, we start to tune in a lot more industrial design and the aesthetic of how we want it to all come together. Really difficult to execute are the bottom bracket and swing link areas, and so packaging that into maximizing front triangle volume and having the right chainstay length, but also tire clearance and also crank clearance and also chainring spec and also main pivot location, all those things is really difficult to fine tune.
Yes.
So, and then making that look good kind of brings us to this bike and having a flex stay and proving out the flex stay. So there's sort of a virtual pivot in here and not an actual pivot in the rear of the bike. That's a whole nother design challenge. So yeah, a lot of iterations. In physical prototypes, there were maybe 5 to 7, but then in simulation prototypes, I can't even tell you, 200 maybe? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, two visible changes, like one you noted here of like having an actual pivot to a virtual pivot. The other, to my ignorant eye, is like the the greatly dropped chainstay on this version versus the raised stay over here. Does that affect the handling or any of the suspension characteristics at all, or is that just a structural design that achieves the same end?
So the goal is to achieve the same end in all attributes, and this chainstay specifically is a bit more efficient. Like if you go back and forth between the two, you need more material to do the drop stay. This design kind of builds on what we've learned from our mountain bikes, squeaking the drive side chainstay in between the chainring and the chain and the tire clearance window. There's just this small area of volume that we can have this higher stay. Then transitioning into the flex stay portion that you asked about, it's very difficult to execute in a lot of the longer travel mountain bikes where they have a lot more deflection at the seat stay. Through travel, they're really making this thing flex a lot. But for our design, 55 millimeters of rear wheel travel, we don't actually need the seat stay to move that much. So because we don't need it to move that much, we can retain a lot of stiffness in the rear triangle, giving it more of a road bike pedaling feel, and not having to sacrifice pedaling efficiency and torsional rigidity in order to give us this rear suspension and flex through the stays that allows the suspension to actuate. That may be a lot of jargon, but essentially we wanted just to ride like a gravel bike, but then by taking out the complexity of the rear pivot, we really simplify the system.
One final question, Your Honor. It wouldn't be a gravel video without talking about gravel tires.
Yeah,
It was fun to watch you ride today. You're like Danny McCaskill, just bouncing around, kicking rocks off the trail. What is your sweet spot for a tire? And I know the answer kind of depends on where you're riding, et cetera, but with this bike, 55 and 60 mil of rear and front travel, what's a good tire for you for that?
Yeah, so we, having the benefit of being Trek and working so closely with Bontrager and our tire team, we've got to develop a tire with this bike. So the 55C Batasso tire is really designed to be optimized for this bike. So the 55C gives the volume that we want. It's not a 2.4 like a lot of the gravel bikes have been trying to maximize out to like a big mountain bike tire. And the reason for that is just that we're still on the road a lot with this bike. We're still, I care a little bit about the aerodynamics of the system. And then that tire is also a burly casing. So kind of as an insurance, that's one of the big things with this bike is you have suspension, you have longer wheelbase, you have more stability. It just gives you more insurance on adventure rides. And that's the big thing about the Batasso tire too, is it's a heavy tire, it's a pretty burly casing. So the 55C hits the sweet spot for volume in my opinion, but then that bit more durability on the tire is really critical. We've tried a lot of different race casing mountain bike tires, and the volume does afford a bit more insurance just because the greater volume gives you more flat protection in some ways. But with sharp thorns and things like that we're definitely going to encounter on this bike, I liked the thicker casing.
So the tire width that comes with this is the one that you like. It's a perk of designing your bike. You can design exactly how you want.
Design the tire. Right. Yeah. I think a lot of people are going to have fun exploring the bounds too of like, since you have suspension and you're not getting your suspension out of the tire, you can try a 45C tire with an insert for that insurance, but then have the rolling resistance be really low because you have a thinner tire, a lighter tire. And then you can go the other way too and use as big of a tire as you want. And to us, that like 2.2 mountain bike race tire is something that I know a lot of people will enjoy. And so we wanted to make sure that fit in the bike.
You do what you like.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, for sure.
RockShox engineer Katie Parody took the lead on this new 60 mil Rudy XL, which for now is only available on this CheckOUT, but will be available for other manufacturers. Trek does have an exclusive on this one particular color to match the wilder alternative color scheme to this bike though.
I started development on Rudy XL in June of 2023. So a little over 2 years.
And what were the project objectives? What were you wanting to bring, and what were Trek or others asking you to execute on?
We obviously had some asks from Trek as far as like tire clearance, geometry, travel. From there, it was really like, how can we make Rudy better? It did really well in the market. People really liked it, but as like continuous improvers and innovators, we were like, how can we take something we really like and make it better? And so a lot of that was a lot of work to optimize the air spring as it grew, and utilizing what we'd learned in our SID projects to add to our Rudy XL, and it's very similar air spring to the SID SL that was recently launched. My actual first project here was changing the Charger 2 damper to fit into the Rudy. So we then took the Charger 2 and made it longer using SID SL parts to fit it into the Rudy XL because we wanted the same damping performance, but we needed a longer length. And I worked really closely with a lot of the Trek engineers to figure out tire clearance and get the maximum that we could with the chassis size for road. And I'm really proud of that, as we did a lot of work there and fitting it in, as well as the fender, because the fender is a 2-bolt fender, much like the SID fenders, and it doesn't come down on the sides. You can still have a very wide tire. You're a little bit limited on the top of it, but your width is not compromised.
Bikes are all about balancing lots of things. Tell me about the balance of tire width and suspension travel for your preferences of riding around here in Colorado Springs.
Yeah.
You know, how much tire do you normally run with this 60 mil XL?
I ran a 2.2 for the longest time because it's not really underbiking because the fork is so capable. I ride a lot of single track, a lot of burly gravel, and I really liked the rolling that it gave me and the compliance. I did a 100-mile gravel race in Fort Collins in July, and that's a lot less technical, so I went down to a 2.1 for that because I was looking for more speed. The downside of a 2.2 is they're pretty heavy, and so I was looking for something lighter, but for aggressive riding, I really enjoy the 2.2.
Do you ever lock out your XL?
All the time.
Yep.
I come from a cyclocross background, and so I'm pretty comfortable with a stiff bike, and so as soon as it's relatively smooth, even like a champagne gravel climb, I will lock it out because for me, I appreciate the stiffness of it, and on pavement, but it's so close to your hand and easy to unlock that if I see a hole coming up, I'll unlock it in the middle of a climb. I use that knob a lot.
I recently rode Flight Attendant for the first time. Love that. Was blown away by, because like you, I like my forks stiff when I'm on pavement and squishy when they're not, and I'd prefer to keep my hands on the bars, and that was a delight to experience that. I want this on this Rudy XL. When are we going to see this?
I mean, we are always working to deliver new and innovative solutions to the customer. I can't give any details.
Yeah, fair enough.
But you're not the first person to ask me for that.
Well, thank you for the ride today, and thanks for all your work on this new technology.
Of course, thank you.
Big picture overall, this is our premium cross-country rear shock, SIDLuxe. You'll see it on cross-country race bikes all over the planet. This one's a little bit special. We took basically the smallest size that we make, and we limited the stroke. So normally, off the shelf, this is a 30 millimeter stroke shock. We've limited that stroke to 27.5, so it'll fit with the Trek geometry, but give you all the performance you'd get out of a mountain bike rear shock.
So what's next? For me, I want to put some other bars on here. These bad boys flare out a full 12 centimeters, and this feels weird to me. There's so much about this bike that is so different from what I normally ride. It's hard to discern what is just strange feeling because it's new and different, and what's strange feeling because it's off. I'm getting a bit more accustomed to it, but I want to spend more time on the bike with bars that are a little closer to home feeling for me. So I'm going to do that. May monkey around with the stem, a longer, maybe a little bit lower position. The dropper post has been a pleasant surprise. Not so much for the technical riding, which I have used, like around here, trying to navigate some of the, for me, bigger drops or trickier bits, but also just for doing long descents. Instead of doing a super tuck like some of my buddies will do, I'll just drop the post and remain comfortably seated while getting low. So I've been surprised by how much I've been using this on relatively normal riding on gravel roads. I'm gonna mess around with the tire selection. These are 55s, which is 2.1 and change in inches. It's such a funny thing with road culture and road measurements in metric getting mushed in with mountain bike designs and measurements in inches. 55 is a 2.1 and change. So this can take a 2.25 for the record, both at the fork, which is a new width, and in the rear. Obviously, this is a collaborative project with SRAM and RockShox, but it's not like you came to this company here in Colorado Springs and said, hey, we want a fork that is this big to go on our gravel bikes? Build it for us.
I think this is bigger than the Rudy XL.
This is like 2028 model of the CheckOUT.
I think when we looked at the capabilities of the bike, one of the things that we recognized was that there wasn't really a suspension solution available in the market at the time, both for tire size and looking at two tires, 55 mil roughly for the capability that we were looking for, and also the travel and suspension performance. And so we did approach RockShox and say like, hey, there's sort of a space in the market and an experience that we're trying to deliver specifically for this bike. They recognize that that's also something that they want to put into the market and sort of grow the capability of gravel bikes more broadly. And so we collaborated on that project and delivered it within the platform of the new CheckOUT. But that fork is going to be available also aftermarket and probably from some other OE brands too. But it was really with the intention of delivering sort of this holistic experience in the CheckOUT and marrying the capabilities of the forks mentioned to the rest of the bike.
Exploring on bikes is a fun thing on any type of bikes, and the gravel seems like it's hit the sweet spot for that type of riding for a lot of people. You just did a bike packing trip in the Upper Peninsula. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I was on a family vacation and we were doing a bike race up in Copper Harbor, which is like way at the tippy top of the UP of Michigan. It's an amazing place to ride bikes. I had my mountain bike there and we were doing a work off-site trip down in Cable, which is about 300 miles away. And so I had my family up in Copper Harbor. They were going home, and then I was going to meet up a bunch of workmates in Cable. And I said, like, why not try to do that as a bike pack adventure? It's a pretty remote area. Like Copper Harbor is way out there. And I found a bikepacking course on bikepackingroutes.com that connected those two dots together. So it's sort of like a predetermined route that I knew someone had already scoped out ahead of time and knew that it was something that was mostly off-road, but was also pretty rideable and was about the right distance. I had 3 days to be able to make it from point A to point B, and it was 330 miles. So it was like a fairly ambitious spread of distance, especially doing it off-road. But there was, I wanted to A, test out the bike, and just B, have a really awesome experience and do something that sort of stretched my limits too. And it turned out to be an amazing ride. The bike was the perfect bike for that environment. There's a lot of ATV trails, forest roads, that kind of stuff. And so having just that little bit of suspension, especially when fully loaded, like just made it a lot more pleasant ride. The bike was super capable for it, and I was able to average like 15 miles an hour for all the days out there too. So it's like a fairly fast ride pace too for off-road. And that efficiency was something that I thought was also a really big differentiator for the CheckOUT that really made it a great experience. And I like doing those big trips too sometimes too, of just, again, pushing myself, being out there by yourself in the wilderness, being self-sufficient. And then coming to the end of the ride, we were in Cable, and the next 2 days we just ripped single track. So I just took all my stuff off, took the rack off, and rode with them. They all had mountain bikes. I was still on the CheckOUT and had an awesome time on the single track. So sort of showed me the breadth of what the bike was capable of, and also just how awesome that experience can be of bike packing, ripping single track, and being able to do it on one single bike.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just necessarily carving a smaller niche in between a gravel bike and a mountain bike, but being able to do some gravel biking, some light mountain biking, and then all the stuff in between.
Yeah, I think that's, to us, the key point of the bike is it can do a lot of things really amazingly. Like I think it'd actually be an awesome unbound bike of like, if you just want to have a super comfortable, capable ride, like it's totally capable of doing that and delivering, again, a great experience. If you want to do something like the Tour Divide, like it's also can do that, and even just a lunch ride where you're connecting some single tracks and fire road and some pavement, it's like you can have a super fun time doing that. So it's like all these different ride scenarios, one bike can deliver a really great experience for, and I think that was sort of the concept that we really embraced, and we hope that this bike really delivers on it.
The thunder is moving in, so I gotta be moving out. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Whether you like your bike rigid, fully suspended, halfway in between, just get out there and enjoy the ride.